Welcome to Sleepy Whisper. Please set your volume just right so this voice can gently drift into your ears. Close your eyes. Let your whole body relax. Allow your mind to drift away from the worries of the day. There's no need to hurry. Just lie still and let your breathing slow down. Tonight, we begin our series Boring History for Sleep with the very first story. How Roman law quietly shaped the world. A calm journey back in time, unhurried and soft, where every word falls like a gentle wave, carrying you deeper into rest. If you enjoy this space, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can meet here every night. Now, let everything out there fade away, and let us begin our story. Roman law did not announce itself with the crash of armies or the clamor of victory. Instead, it seeped quietly into the fabric of the ancient world, weaving a set of principles that would outlast empires, languages, and the very stones of Rome itself. To understand how it shaped the world, we must first picture the Roman Republic in its early days, when law was not yet a written code for all to see, but a collection of customs, rituals, and the judgments of magistrates passed down orally through generations. In those times, the patricians, the aristocratic families who held political and religious authority, guarded the knowledge of law as if it were a secret treasure accessible only to those within their ranks. Ordinary citizens, the plebeians, often found themselves at a disadvantage, for without knowing the rules, one could not fairly defend oneself. This imbalance led to growing tension and eventually to one of the first great turning points in legal history, the creation of the 12 tables around 450 BCE. These bronze tablets, set up in the Roman Forum, were a simple yet revolutionary idea: laws written down for all to see so that justice could not be twisted in the shadows. The 12 tables dealt with matters as ordinary as property boundaries and debt repayment, and as grave as punishment for theft or injury. Though by modern standards they might seem harsh, with penalties that included exile, slavery, or even death, they established the principle that the law should be known, fixed, and applied equally to citizens. Over time, Roman law grew in complexity, shaped by the needs of a city that became a republic, and a republic that became an empire. Magistrates, especially the praetors, played a crucial role in adapting the law to changing circumstances, issuing annual edicts that acted like legal guidelines for the cases they would hear that year. In this way, Roman law avoided becoming rigid. It evolved slowly, responding to the realities of trade, war, migration, and governance over an ever-expanding territory. As Rome conquered new lands, it faced the challenge of ruling over people with their own customs and legal traditions. Rather than simply replacing local laws with Roman ones, the Romans often blended them, allowing a degree of local autonomy while ensuring that certain key Roman principles, such as contracts, property rights, and the authority of the state, remained intact. This flexibility helped the empire maintain order over vast distances and diverse cultures, binding them together under a shared legal framework. The influence of Greek philosophy also seeped into Roman legal thought, particularly through the Stoics, who believed in a universal law of reason and justice that applied to all humans, regardless of their nationality. This idea gradually merged with Roman practicality, leading to concepts such as natural law, which would echo centuries later in the Enlightenment. By the time of the early empire, jurists, trained legal scholars, had begun to emerge as important figures, offering written opinions on complex legal matters and compiling treatises that distilled centuries of precedent into coherent principles. Names like Gaius, Ulpian, and Papinian would become respected not only in their own time, but for generations afterward. These jurists did not simply record the law. They refined it, clarifying ambiguities, resolving contradictions, and creating a legal language precise enough to govern trade across continents and personal disputes in village markets alike. Roman law also recognized that the needs of society could change, and so it distinguished between ius civile, the law specific to Roman citizens, and ius gentium, the law of nations, applied more broadly to foreigners and interactions between different peoples. This separation allowed Rome to govern both its own citizens and the many non-citizens under its rule with a degree of fairness that helped maintain loyalty, or at least reduce rebellion. In this first chapter of its history, we see Roman law as both a tool of power and a framework for justice, an invisible structure that made daily life predictable in an unpredictable world. Long after the bronze tablets of the 12 tables had crumbled, the ideas they embodied continued to live, quietly shaping how humans thought about law, rights, and the responsibilities of the state. As the centuries passed, the reach of Roman law extended far beyond the city walls, carried along the roads that tied together an empire, stretching from the windswept coasts of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Egypt. Each province, with its own languages, gods, and customs, was slowly drawn into a shared rhythm of administration, taxation, and legal order. The governor of a distant territory might rule from a marble hall or a modest provincial forum, yet he did so within the same legal framework as his counterparts in Italy. This uniformity was one of Rome's quiet strengths. It meant that a merchant from Gaul could sign a contract in Alexandria and expect it to be enforced with the same principles that applied in Rome itself. Over time, the blending of local practices with Roman statutes created a rich tapestry of law that was both universal and adaptable. In places where Roman citizenship was rare, the ius gentium, the law of nations, offered a bridge between cultures, ensuring that trade disputes, property claims, and even criminal cases could be resolved without the constant friction of clashing traditions. The granting of Roman citizenship became not only a political act, but also a legal transformation, conferring rights that were respected across the empire's vast expanse. This process culminated in 212 CE, when Emperor Caracalla issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, extending citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. With this single decree, the legal world of Rome became truly universal within its borders, binding millions under the same laws and protections. Yet even in this moment of unity, Roman law retained its capacity to evolve. The jurists of the later empire worked tirelessly to collect, compare, and reconcile the immense body of statutes, edicts, and precedents that had accumulated over centuries. They understood that the law was not just a tool for rulers, but a framework for everyday life, governing marriage contracts, inheritance disputes, land sales, and the rights of freedmen. In their meticulous commentaries, we see a dedication to clarity and precision that speaks to the Roman belief in law as an anchor in uncertain times. The practical nature of Roman law also meant that it avoided becoming overly abstract. While it could be informed by lofty ideas of justice, it was grounded in the realities of human behavior, commerce, and governance. Even the most philosophical concepts, like natural law, were applied with an eye toward resolving tangible disputes. The late empire faced mounting challenges: economic strain, political instability, and the pressures of defending long frontiers. But the legal system remained one of its most resilient institutions. It outlasted emperors, civil wars, and invasions, in part because it was woven into the daily lives of people across the empire. From farmers in the provinces to senators in Rome, all relied on the stability it provided. When the Western Roman Empire finally crumbled in the 5th century, Roman law did not vanish with it. Instead, it lingered in the practices of local courts, in the records of scribes, and in the memories of those trained in its principles. In the eastern half of the empire, in what became the Byzantine Empire, Roman law continued to thrive, adapting to new realities while preserving its core. This endurance hints at a deeper truth, that the true legacy of Rome was not just in its monuments or military conquests, but in the quiet persistence of a legal tradition that promised order in a world often marked by chaos. By the time medieval kingdoms rose from the fragments of the old empire, the seeds of Roman law had already taken root in the soil of Europe, ready to influence the codes and charters that would emerge in the centuries to come. In the centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the legal landscape of Europe was a patchwork of customs, feudal obligations, and remnants of older systems. Yet the ghost of Roman law moved quietly through it all, shaping how rulers and scholars thought about governance and justice. In the Byzantine Empire, which preserved much of Rome's administrative and cultural heritage, Emperor Justinian I undertook one of the most ambitious legal projects in history, the Corpus Juris Civilis, or Body of Civil Law, compiled in the 6th century. This monumental work gathered together centuries of statutes, legal opinions, and imperial decrees, distilling them into a coherent structure that could be studied, applied, and passed on. It consisted of the Codex, which collected laws issued by emperors, the Digest, a vast anthology of writings from the great jurists, the Institutes, a legal textbook for students, and the Novelli, which recorded new laws enacted after the Codex was completed. The Corpus Juris Civilis was not just a compilation, it was a preservation of Roman legal thought, a bridge between antiquity and the medieval world. While the Byzantine Empire maintained this tradition in the East, the Latin West gradually rediscovered it during the 11th and 12th centuries, when scholars in places like Bologna began to study ancient manuscripts with renewed interest. At the University of Bologna, the first great law school of medieval Europe, teachers known as glossators pored over the Digest, adding detailed notes in the margins to explain and reconcile its sometimes complex or contradictory passages. They treated Roman law as a living system, capable of guiding contemporary disputes and informing the laws of emerging states. This revival was not purely academic. As kings, princes, and city councils sought more effective ways to govern, they saw in Roman law a model of organization, clarity, and authority that could strengthen their own rule. The idea that laws should be written, consistent, and grounded in reason appealed to rulers trying to bring order to territories fractured by centuries of war and local autonomy. In many places, Roman legal principles began to mingle with local customary law, influencing everything from property rights to criminal procedure. The notion of legal contracts, carefully defined obligations, and protections for certain classes of people began to reappear, adapted to the needs of a feudal society. Even the Church, whose canon law governed matters of faith, marriage, and ecclesiastical discipline, borrowed heavily from Roman law, both in its terminology and in its methods of legal reasoning. The study of law became a respected profession, with jurists and notaries playing vital roles in the administration of justice. Though much of medieval Europe was still bound by personal loyalty and unwritten custom, the reintroduction of Roman legal concepts created a foundation upon which more centralized systems of governance could be built. Over time, the influence of Roman law extended beyond the courts, shaping the way people thought about the relationship between ruler and subject, rights and responsibilities, and the idea that there could be principles of justice that stood above the will of any single person. In this way, Roman law continued to work quietly in the background, not through conquest or force, but through the persistent attraction of a system that promised order, predictability, and fairness in a world that often lacked all three. By the late Middle Ages, the quiet but steady influence of Roman law was beginning to shape not only the intellectual life of Europe, but also the political ambitions of its rulers. As kingdoms consolidated power and sought to extend their authority over diverse and sometimes resistant territories, the appeal of a uniform legal framework became ever stronger. Roman law offered that framework, a body of principles that could be applied consistently across regions, yet flexible enough to be adapted to local realities. Monarchs found in it a tool for strengthening centralized governance, reducing the arbitrary power of local lords, and increasing the reach of royal courts. The concept that law should be a coherent system, interpreted by trained judges rather than imposed solely by the will of a ruler, resonated with those seeking stability. In towns and cities, the rise of commerce brought new challenges, from regulating trade across distant markets to resolving disputes between merchants of different origins. Roman contract law, with its precise definitions of obligation, consent, and breach, provided a ready-made solution. Guilds and municipal councils often incorporated these principles into their charters, and in doing so, they brought a measure of predictability to the bustling marketplaces of medieval Europe. At the same time, universities continued to teach the Corpus Juris Civilis, producing generations of lawyers and administrators who could interpret and apply its rules. These educated professionals became valuable assets to rulers and city-states, serving as advisors, diplomats, and judges. Even in regions that clung to strong customary traditions, such as England, the influence of Roman law seeped in indirectly, shaping the thought of scholars and legislators. The intellectual reach of Roman legal concepts extended into philosophy and political theory, influencing debates about sovereignty, justice, and the nature of law itself. Thinkers began to revisit ideas of natural law, the belief that certain rights and moral principles are inherent to all humans, an idea that had been articulated in the Roman era and carried forward by medieval jurists. This concept would later become a cornerstone of Enlightenment thought, inspiring legal reforms and the drafting of modern constitutions. But in the medieval world, the power of Roman law lay in its quiet persistence, in the way it could be invoked to settle a dispute, legitimize a treaty, or structure the governance of a city without fanfare or force. Its endurance was aided by the Church, whose canon law courts borrowed heavily from Roman procedures and terminology, reinforcing them through their widespread jurisdiction over matters such as marriage, inheritance, and moral conduct. Over time, the boundaries between secular and ecclesiastical law blurred in practice, as both drew from the same ancient source. This shared foundation helped create a sense of legal continuity across Europe, even in an age marked by fragmentation and conflict. The survival of Roman law into the modern era was not the result of any single dramatic event, but rather the cumulative effect of countless small applications: a contract drafted here, a legal dispute resolved there, a royal edict framed in terms that echoed ancient statutes. In this way, Roman law continued its quiet work, guiding decisions and shaping expectations, long after the last Roman emperor in the West had faded into history. As Europe moved into the early modern period, the influence of Roman law began to take on new dimensions, quietly underpinning the legal reforms of emerging nation-states and providing the intellectual scaffolding for a rapidly changing world. The Renaissance brought a revival of classical learning, and with it, a renewed interest in the precision and logic of Roman jurisprudence. Scholars approached the ancient texts not merely as historical artifacts, but as practical guides for organizing society. In courts and legislative assemblies, the systematic approach of Roman law, its careful definitions, structured reasoning, and emphasis on written statutes, offered a model for creating laws that could apply equally across increasingly complex societies. This was a time when monarchs sought to centralize power, bureaucracies expanded, and commerce reached across oceans, bringing distant lands into contact and conflict. In such a world, the need for consistent legal principles became more pressing. Roman law's concepts of contractual obligation, property rights, and corporate entities found new relevance in governing trade companies, colonial administrations, and financial institutions. Even in places where local customary law remained dominant, the underlying logic of Roman legal thought influenced the drafting of statutes and the training of judges. In France, the process of codifying regional laws often involved reconciling them with principles drawn from the corpus juris civilis, while in the Holy Roman Empire, the reception of Roman law was so thorough that it became the primary legal system in many German states. The universities continued to serve as vital conduits for this transmission, producing lawyers who could navigate both ancient principles and contemporary realities. Beyond the courts, the philosophical ideas embedded in Roman law began to inspire political thinkers to question the nature of authority and the relationship between the individual and the state. The notion that law should be based on reason and serve the common good resonated with Enlightenment writers who would go on to influence revolutions and constitutional reforms. Yet the spread of Roman law in this era was still a quiet one. It did not arrive with the shock of conquest, but with the calm persistence of study, teaching, and practical application. Its adaptability allowed it to be woven into the fabric of different legal traditions without erasing them, creating hybrid systems that reflected both local identity and universal principles. This quiet resilience ensured that, by the dawn of the modern age, Roman law was no longer the possession of a fallen empire, but a shared inheritance of Europe, ready to shape the laws of nations that had never known the rule of Rome itself. It had moved beyond the marble halls and dusty forums of antiquity, finding a home in the written codes of kings, the decisions of judges, and the minds of those who believed that order, fairness, and reason should guide human affairs. And still, without fanfare, it continued to prepare the ground for one of its greatest transformations: the emergence of comprehensive national legal codes that would carry its principles into the modern world. The 19th century marked one of the most significant moments in the long afterlife of Roman law, for it was in this period that its principles were distilled into the great codifications that would govern modern nations. Nowhere was this more evident than in France, where the Napoleonic Code, officially enacted in 1804, sought to unify the patchwork of regional laws that had persisted since the Middle Ages. Napoleon's jurists, drawing deeply from the structure and clarity of Roman jurisprudence, crafted a civil code that was logical, systematic, and accessible to ordinary citizens. It organized the law into clear divisions: persons, property, and the acquisition of property, echoing the tripartite structure of the Institutes of Justinian. The code emphasized equality before the law, the sanctity of contracts, and the protection of property rights, principles that could be traced back to the ancient statutes and juristic writings of Rome. This codification was not merely a French achievement. It became a model exported to countries across Europe, Latin America, and beyond, influencing legal systems from Belgium to Egypt, from Italy to Japan. In Germany, a similar process unfolded with the creation of the Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch, or civil code, which came into force in 1900. German legal scholars had long studied Roman law under the system known as the Pandectus tradition, which sought to analyze and organize the entire body of private law on the foundation of Roman principles. The result was a code that combined the precision of German legal science with the enduring logic of Roman doctrine. In Italy, the newly unified state adopted its own civil code, again grounded in the structure and categories inherited from antiquity. Even in places far from Europe, colonial expansion carried these codes, and with them the essence of Roman law, to Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The adaptability of these codifications lay in their balance between universal principles and local needs, just as Rome had once adapted its ius gentium to govern diverse peoples. These modern codes distilled centuries of legal thought into language that could be applied by judges, studied by students, and understood by the public. They also reinforced the idea that the law should be a coherent, accessible system, rather than a maze of unwritten customs and shifting decrees. In this way, the Roman vision of law, as a public, knowable, and rational framework for society, found fresh expression in the modern age. The codification movement also deepened the global reach of Roman law, creating a common legal vocabulary among nations that might otherwise share little in culture or history. Whether in the civil codes of Latin America, the mixed legal systems of South Africa, or the commercial laws of East Asia, echoes of Roman principles could be heard. In the way contracts were formed, property was transferred, or disputes were resolved. It was a reminder that the empire's most enduring conquest had not been of land or peoples, but of the human imagination in persuading generation after generation that order, fairness, and clarity were worth striving for in the governance of human affairs. While much of the modern world organizes its private law through codifications inspired by the civil law tradition rooted in Rome, there exists another great legal family, the common law, which developed primarily in England and later spread to countries such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and others. At first glance, the common law might seem far removed from the structured, codified approach of Roman law, for it relies heavily on judicial decisions, precedent, and the gradual accumulation of case law, rather than on comprehensive written codes. Yet even here, Roman influence can be found, quietly woven into the fabric of legal reasoning. Medieval English law was shaped in part by the clerics and scholars who had studied Roman and canon law on the continent, and they brought with them concepts of procedure, property, and contract that were subtly absorbed into English practice. The very idea that legal principles could be reasoned out systematically, that certain doctrines could be generalized beyond the specifics of a single case, reflected the intellectual habits of Roman jurists. Over the centuries, as common law countries expanded and engaged in trade with civil law nations, they encountered Roman-based legal systems and borrowed useful elements. In areas such as commercial law, maritime law, and international trade, the influence of Roman principles became even more apparent. The law of the sea, for example, developed through centuries of cross-cultural exchange and drew upon Roman ideas about shared resources, obligations between parties, and the resolution of disputes in neutral forums. International law itself, the set of rules and principles governing relations between states, owes a considerable debt to Roman legal thought, particularly the concept of ius gentium, the law of nations that Rome had once used to govern interactions with peoples beyond its citizenship. Modern treaties, diplomatic conventions, and rules of war often rest on foundations first laid in the legal experiments of the ancient world. This convergence of traditions shows that Roman law's influence was not limited to the countries that directly adopted its codes. It also shaped the legal vocabulary and methods of those who took a different path. In the globalized world of the 19th and 20th centuries, legal scholars from both traditions studied each other's systems, finding points of compatibility and mutual enrichment. As a result, many common law jurisdictions have incorporated statutes or doctrines clearly descended from Roman concepts, whether in the rules governing corporations, the protection of personal property, or the enforcement of contractual promises. Likewise, civil law jurisdictions have sometimes adopted procedural practices more typical of the common law, creating a dynamic exchange that continues to this day. Beneath this interplay lies a shared commitment to the idea that law should be a rational guide for human conduct, not merely the arbitrary will of those in power. That idea, nurtured in the streets and courts of ancient Rome, still whispers through courtrooms, legislative halls, and classrooms around the world. Even in places where Roman law was never formally received, its quiet logic and enduring principles have found a way to take root, shaping decisions, influencing reforms, and reminding societies that law, at its best, is a patient, steady force, one that works not through spectacle or coercion, but through the trust it builds over time. In the 20th century, as the world faced the aftermath of two devastating global wars and the collapse of empires, the principles of Roman law found renewed relevance in the shaping of human rights, constitutional governance, and the frameworks of international cooperation. The devastation left by these conflicts created a pressing need for legal systems that could protect individuals from the unchecked power of states and ensure that justice was not merely a local or national concern, but a universal one. In crafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the drafters drew, whether consciously or through the long lineage of legal tradition, on Roman concepts such as the inherent dignity of the person, the equality of all citizens before the law, and the idea that certain rights are inalienable, belonging to individuals simply by virtue of their humanity. These principles echoed the ancient notion of natural law, which had been articulated by Roman jurists and philosophers, carried into medieval thought by scholars in the Church, and refined over centuries into a moral foundation for modern law. At the same time, many newly independent nations looked to Roman-inspired civil codes as models for building their own legal systems, valuing their clarity, adaptability, and tested structure. The post-war period also saw the establishment of supranational organizations like the European Economic Community, later the European Union, which required the harmonization of laws across member states. This effort was made easier by the shared Roman heritage of most continental European legal systems, allowing trade, labor, and environmental regulations to be framed in ways that resonated with familiar legal principles. Even constitutional law in many countries bears the quiet imprint of Rome, from the organization of governmental powers to the codification of citizens' rights and responsibilities. The separation of powers, though developed in later political theory, can trace its roots to the Roman Republic's system of checks and balances among magistrates, assemblies, and the Senate. The concept of due process, the right to a fair trial, and protections against arbitrary punishment also find their distant ancestors in the procedural safeguards of Roman courts. In the realm of international law, the establishment of bodies like the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court reflects a belief, present since the time of the ius gentium, that there must be legal norms capable of transcending national boundaries. Here too, Roman law's influence is evident in the structure of proceedings, the definition of crimes, and the recognition of both state and individual accountability. This global legal architecture, though built in a vastly different age, carries forward the Roman ideal that law should be a unifying force, capable of bringing order to a fractured world. In quiet but profound ways, the ancient legal mind of Rome still guides the search for justice in the modern era, proving that ideas forged 2,000 years ago can remain relevant, resilient, and deeply human in their reach. In the present day, the legacy of Roman law continues to live not only in the statutes and constitutions of nations, but also in the classrooms, libraries, and lecture halls where new generations of legal minds are trained. Across Europe, Latin America, parts of Africa, and much of Asia, law students still encounter the structures and terminology that originated in ancient Rome, often studying excerpts from the Corpus Juris Civilis, or tracing the lineage of modern legal principles back to their classical sources. Even in countries with common law traditions, Comparative law courses introduce students to the logic and categories of the civil law system, highlighting how concepts such as contracts, torts, and property ownership have roots in Roman thought. Legal education often emphasizes the analytical methods refined by Roman jurists, the practice of breaking down complex disputes into clear issues, applying general principles to specific facts, and reasoning toward a consistent and fair resolution. This approach remains as relevant in the negotiation of a 21st century international trade agreement as it was in settling a dispute between merchants in the Roman Forum. In the globalized world, where business, technology, and migration connect distant societies more closely than ever before, the value of a shared legal vocabulary becomes clear. Roman law provides part of that vocabulary, offering a set of concepts understood across borders, even when local customs differ. In international arbitration, for example, the principles of good faith in contractual dealings, the protection of acquired rights, and the enforcement of obligations often rely on formulations that can be traced directly to ancient precedents. Law schools also use Roman law as a training ground for developing precise legal reasoning, because its cases and principles, though centuries old, present timeless problems about fairness, responsibility, and the balance between individual and collective interests. Beyond academia, the influence of Roman law persists in the everyday practice of law. Judges cite doctrines that have been preserved through centuries of commentary. Legislators draft statutes using classifications first articulated in Latin, and legal professionals across continents rely on procedural safeguards that originated in the courts of the Roman Republic and Empire. Modern technology has even made ancient legal texts more accessible than ever. Digitized manuscripts, searchable databases, and online courses allow scholars and practitioners worldwide to engage directly with the sources of Roman jurisprudence. This accessibility ensures that the ideas of Gaius, Ulpian, and Justinian continue to be read, debated, and applied in contexts far removed from their original world. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this enduring legacy is not merely the preservation of ancient rules, but the continued relevance of their underlying values. The belief that law should be coherent, public, and grounded in reason, that it should serve as a guide for human behavior rather than a weapon of arbitrary power, and that it should evolve to meet the needs of changing societies without losing sight of principles that protect fairness and justice. In this way, the study and teaching of Roman law today is not an exercise in nostalgia, but a living dialogue between the past and the present, a quiet reminder that some of the best tools for building a just future were crafted long before our time. Looking back across 2 millennia, the story of Roman law is not one of sudden conquest or dramatic revolutions, but of a steady, almost imperceptible shaping of the way humans think about rules, rights, and responsibilities. It began as a set of customs guarded by a small group of patricians in a single city and grew into a written code that all citizens could see. It expanded alongside the Roman Republic and Empire, adapting to govern provinces as distant as Britain and Egypt, and blending with local traditions to create systems that were both flexible and consistent. It survived the collapse of political structures, preserved in the careful compilations of Byzantine emperors and the notes of medieval scholars. It guided the rise of nation-states, provided a model for codifications that still serve as the backbone of many modern legal systems, and offered a vocabulary for international cooperation in an interconnected world. Its influence reached even into places that never fell under Roman control, as common law traditions absorbed its concepts and international law embraced its vision of norms that apply beyond the boundaries of any one nation. In the 20th and 21st centuries, it has shaped the development of human rights, inspired constitutional protections, and provided a shared foundation for global trade, diplomacy, and governance. What makes this legacy remarkable is its quiet endurance, the way it has persisted not because it was imposed by force, but because generation after generation found it useful, fair, and adaptable. The principles it carried forward, that laws should be public and predictable, that they should be grounded in reason, that they should protect the dignity and equality of individuals, remain as relevant now as they were in the Roman Forum. In the background of our daily lives, whether we are signing a contract, buying property, settling a dispute, or relying on the promise of a fair trial, we are touched by ideas first shaped in an ancient world of marble columns and crowded marketplaces. The people who drafted the 12 tables, the jurists who refined the digest, the emperors who issued edicts, and the scholars who kept these texts alive could not have imagined a planet connected by instantaneous communication, vast international trade, and complex political alliances. Yet their work endures, guiding decisions in courtrooms, influencing the drafting of new laws, and shaping the education of those who will interpret them for the next generation. The story of Roman law is therefore not just a chapter in the history of law, but a testament to the enduring power of ideas. Ideas that can survive the rise and fall of empires, cross oceans and cultures, and remain vital in shaping the human experience. It is a reminder that the most lasting forms of influence often do not announce themselves loudly, but work quietly, steadily, and patiently, leaving a mark so deep that it becomes part of the very structure of our lives. And so, as we bring this long journey to a close, we can see that Roman law has not truly ended. It continues to live, adapt, and speak in the calm and persistent voice of a tradition that has quietly shaped the world. That was the end of our story. Before we move on to the next one, I would be so grateful if you could give me a like and a subscribe. And now, let us continue with the next chapter in our Boring History for Sleep series, as we step into the long life of a Roman mosaic artist. In the heart of the Roman Empire, where marble streets caught the sun and public fountains sang softly into stone basins, there lived artisans whose work would outlast the rise and fall of emperors, the mosaic makers. Among them was one whose long life spanned decades of change, a craftsman born in a modest quarter near the Tiber River in the days when the empire's power still felt unshakable. His early years were shaped by the smells of wet mortar and freshly cut stone, by the quiet concentration of older craftsmen bent over their work, and by the steady rhythm of placing tesserae, those tiny cubes of colored glass, stone, or ceramic, into intricate patterns. As a boy, he began with simple tasks, carrying baskets of stone chips, mixing lime with sand to make mortar, sweeping the workshop floor at the end of the day. But as the years passed, his eyes learned to see the difference between shades of ochre and gold, between the deep blues of lapis lazuli and the softer tones of local limestone. His hands learned the delicate pressure needed to set a tessera so it lay perfectly flush with its neighbors, catching light in just the right way. In Rome, mosaics adorned the floors of wealthy villas, the walls of bathhouses, and the apses of temples. They told stories of gods and heroes, of hunts and feasts, and sometimes of simple, beautiful scenes from everyday life. A bowl of fruit, a pair of doves drinking from a fountain, a ship riding gentle waves. The young apprentice watched as his master sketched designs on plaster, always mindful of how the image would appear when seen from above, always balancing color, shape, and line so that the whole composition seemed alive. When he was finally trusted to place his first pieces in a client's mosaic, it was a border pattern, repeating geometric forms that required precision and patience. It was not grand work, but he took pride in it, for each tiny cube was a step toward mastery. Over time, commissions grew more elaborate. He traveled beyond Rome to Ostia, to Capua, even to distant provinces, carrying with him tools worn smooth by use, iron nippers for cutting tesserae, wooden-handled trowels, and a leather pouch of pigments for coloring mortar when needed. In the provinces, he encountered new influences: Greek patterns in the eastern cities, bold African animal scenes in the villas of Carthage, and delicate floral motifs along the Mediterranean coast. Each region had its own taste, yet all shared the Roman love for mosaics as both decoration and storytelling. The work was demanding, often requiring hours of kneeling on hard surfaces, leaning over the design, and working by the light of oil lamps when the day grew dim. Yet it was also meditative, each piece of stone or glass finding its place in the larger picture. He learned that a mosaic was more than the sum of its tesserae. It was a story frozen in time, a collaboration between artist, patron, and the materials themselves. As the years passed and his reputation grew, he began to take apprentices of his own, passing down the knowledge he had once received. He taught them how to prepare the foundation so it would endure for centuries, how to choose stones that would hold their color even under the wear of countless footsteps, and how to arrange pieces so that the play of light would bring the image to life. In those early decades of his career, The empire seemed eternal, and so did the demand for his craft. He could not yet know that the mosaics he created would one day survive in fragments, telling future generations not only of Roman gods and heroes, but also of the patient hands that shaped them. As the mosaic artist entered the middle years of his life, his skills had matured into a quiet mastery that was recognized in both the bustling streets of Rome and the quieter provincial towns. His hands moved with practiced certainty, cutting each tessera with the smallest flick of the wrist, aligning them so precisely that the seams seemed to disappear into the image. By now, he had worked on grand commissions, sprawling floor scenes in the villas of senators, depicting hunts with leaping stags and hounds mid-stride, serene marine landscapes for bathhouses, where dolphins danced through curling waves, intricate mythological panels for temples, where gods stood immortal in stone. These projects required months of labor, from the first drawing on a smooth layer of plaster to the final polishing of the finished work. Patrons would sometimes visit the workshop to watch him work, impressed by how he could bring life to stone, coaxing movement and depth from materials that were, by nature, cold and rigid. Yet he found equal satisfaction in simpler tasks: a border of ivy leaves curling along a corridor, a set of tiny medallions for a dining room floor. He understood that not every work had to tell an epic story. Sometimes a mosaic's purpose was to invite the viewer to pause, to notice the play of light across a curve, or to appreciate the harmony of repeating forms. His journeys for work took him further afield, to Gaul, Hispania, and the rich cities of North Africa, where the sun lit the stones in warmer tones and the air carried the scent of distant deserts. In each place, he adapted his designs to local tastes, learning that in the villas along the African coast, patrons favored mosaics filled with exotic animals: lions with flowing manes, elephants mid-step, and flocks of bright birds in flight, while in Gaul they preferred robust geometric patterns that echoed the weaving traditions of the region. The road itself became a familiar companion, with long days of travel by cart or ship, carrying crates of stone and tools, sometimes working under open skies, sometimes in the echoing coolness of unfinished halls. Over the years, he had seen how mosaics could endure far longer than the buildings they adorned. Fires might scorch the walls, storms might tear at roofs, but the floors, if made well, remained, their images still visible under the dust. He took pride in this permanence, imagining that long after his own name was forgotten, someone might look down at a panel of doves or a border of vine leaves and wonder about the hands that placed each piece. The work also brought challenges: aching knees from long hours bent over, eyes strained from sorting subtle shades of stone, and the ever-present pressure to satisfy wealthy patrons whose tastes could be unpredictable. Yet he welcomed these demands, for they kept his mind sharp and his craft alive. By now, his apprentices had grown skilled enough to take on large portions of the work, freeing him to focus on the most delicate parts of a design: the curve of a face, the glint in an animal's eye, the shimmer of water rendered in shades of blue and green. These years were a time of steady prosperity, but also of growing awareness that the world beyond his workshop was changing. The empire still stretched far, but rumors of unrest traveled with merchants and travelers, and the roads he once took for granted as safe now required more caution. Still, he continued to create, each mosaic a quiet affirmation that beauty and craftsmanship could outlast the troubles of any age. As the years moved on, the mosaic artist found himself entering a quieter phase of life, though his hands remained as steady as they had been in his youth. He no longer rushed from city to city in search of commissions. Instead, patrons came to him, sending letters sealed with wax to request his work, or traveling themselves to his modest but well-equipped workshop near the old market square. Here, he kept stacks of stone sorted by color and texture, jars of powdered pigments for special effects, and neatly arranged tools that had served him for decades. The floor of the workshop was sprinkled with chips of marble and glass, catching the light when the sun streamed in through the high windows. He would spend his mornings reviewing designs, sketching new patterns on parchment, and discussing with clients the themes they wanted. Some favored scenes from mythology, others portraits of family members, and still others geometric designs meant simply to bring harmony to a room. His afternoons were devoted to the slow, deliberate work of setting tesserae, often with apprentices seated nearby, each absorbed in their own part of the project. The artist had learned that every mosaic was a collaboration, not only between the master and his assistants, but also between the craft and the materials themselves. The stones sometimes dictated their own arrangement, a particular piece of marble suggesting the curve of a wave, or a fragment of glass perfectly suited to the highlight in an eye. These moments reminded him that his work was as much about listening to the materials as it was about shaping them. On occasion, he was invited to restore older mosaics, some of them laid by hands long gone. In these tasks, he approached the work with quiet reverence, carefully lifting and replacing damaged tesserae so that the original artist's vision remained intact. He understood that in doing so, he was part of an unbroken chain of craftsmen stretching back generations, each leaving behind something that might endure for centuries. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, he would sit outside the workshop, the air cooling as the sun dipped low, and listen to the sounds of the city, merchants calling out the last of their wares, children's laughter echoing from narrow streets, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. He knew that the city had changed since his youth. Buildings had risen and fallen, new markets had opened, and familiar faces had disappeared. Yet the demand for mosaics remained, for they were not simply decorations but markers of memory, symbols of prosperity, and testaments to the skill and patience of those who made them. In these quieter years, he also began to think more about the stories behind each commission. He imagined the feasts that would take place over a banquet hall floor he had tiled, the whispered conversations in a bathhouse beneath the gaze of his marine scenes, the solemn rituals performed in temples where gods and heroes looked down from his designs. Though he had never sought fame, he took comfort in knowing that his work was woven into the lives of people across the empire, from senators in Rome to farmers in distant provinces who had saved for years to commission a modest floor pattern. Each mosaic was a fragment of the larger story of the empire, and through them, his life's work became part of something far greater than himself. In the later decades of his life, the mosaic artist began to notice the subtle ways in which the world around him was shifting, changes that crept in quietly, like the slow wearing of a well-trodden floor. The city still bustled with merchants and travelers, but the faces of the soldiers at the gates were younger now, and their armor bore signs of long campaigns far from home. Stories reached him of unrest along the frontiers, of provinces in need of repair, of trade routes disrupted by dual and distant conflicts. Yet within the walls of his workshop, the rhythm of his work remained unchanged. The cutting of tesserae, the mixing of mortar, the careful placement of each tiny piece into its bed, these things still brought him a sense of calm and purpose. Patrons continued to seek him out, though their requests sometimes reflected the changing times. Where once there had been lavish commissions depicting gods in all their glory, there were now more modest scenes, pastoral landscapes, simple patterns, symbols of hope or resilience. He adjusted without complaint, understanding that art, like the world it lives in, must adapt to the needs of the moment. His apprentices, some of whom had been with him for decades, were now masters in their own right, taking on commissions under their own names while still returning to the workshop to consult with him or share news from their travels. Together, they would sit at the long work table, discussing the fine details of shading a bird's feathers or the most durable way to set glass so that it would not lose its luster over time. Occasionally, he would take on restoration work for mosaics damaged by neglect or disaster. These tasks often brought him into the grand halls of older villas, where the floors he had once laid remained intact, the colors still vibrant beneath layers of dust. Seeing his earlier work stirred a quiet pride in him, a reminder that craftsmanship could endure even when the world changed. On some evenings, he found himself walking along the Tiber, reflecting on the arc of his life, from a boy sweeping the floors of a workshop to an artist whose creations now adorned homes, public spaces, and sacred places across the empire. He thought often about the thousands upon thousands of tesserae he had placed, each one a small act of patience, each one contributing to a larger whole. That was, he realized, the lesson of his trade, that lasting beauty and meaning are built not in sudden bursts, but in the accumulation of countless small, careful acts. The empire might shift and falter, rulers might come and go, but the work of patient hands could still speak across generations. And so, in those quiet twilight hours, with the smell of fresh mortar still lingering on his clothes. He would return to his workshop, light an oil lamp, and place just a few more stones into the waiting design, each one set with the same care he had given on his very first day as an apprentice, knowing that somewhere in the far future, another set of eyes might look upon it and see not only the image, but the lifetime of work it represented. By the time his hair had turned the color of pale marble and his hands bore the fine lines of decades at work, the mosaic artist had become something of a fixture in the city, known not only for his craft, but for the quiet wisdom that seemed to settle over him like the evening light on a finished floor. Younger artisans sought him out for guidance, not just on the technical matters of cutting stone or blending colors, but on the slower lessons of patience, discipline, and the understanding that beauty comes from harmony as much as from skill. His workshop, once a place of constant hammering and scraping, now often held a more measured pace, with long pauses as he examined a design or ran his fingers gently over a nearly finished panel. He had begun to keep a small collection of his own pieces, works not commissioned by patrons, but created for the simple pleasure of shaping an image that existed only in his mind. Some were experimental, patterns inspired by the weaving of cloth or the ripples on the surface of the Tiber at sunset, while others were simple studies of a bird, a flower, or a fragment of a myth he had loved since boyhood. These private works were kept in a back room, stacked carefully and wrapped in cloth, perhaps for no other reason than to remind him that art could be made without the expectation of payment or display. Outside the workshop, the city continued to change. There were more soldiers in the streets now, more talk of taxes and shortages, more uncertainty in the voices of merchants at the market. Yet within his walls, the same timeless ritual continued. The preparation of the surface, the slow laying of the tesserae, the quiet satisfaction when a curve or a shadow appeared exactly as intended. Sometimes he would be asked to repair mosaics that were centuries old, laid by masters whose names had long been forgotten. In these moments, he felt a kinship across time, knowing that the same tools, the same motions, and the same patience had been passed down from one generation to the next. He also began to notice the way his apprentices, now grown and with students of their own, spoke of him to others, not as a distant master, but as a steady presence who had taught them not only how to work, but how to live a life guided by care and constancy. As the days grew quieter, he found joy in the small rituals, the morning light filtering through the high windows, the smell of wet stone, the soft scrape of a tool smoothing an edge. In the evenings, he would sit outside and watch the shadows lengthen across the streets, thinking of all the patterns he had set into floors and walls, and of the countless steps that would pass over them long after he was gone. He knew now that his legacy would not be his name. Few would remember it, but the enduring beauty of the work itself, scattered across cities and provinces, waiting patiently beneath the dust of time to be seen again. In the later years of his life, the mosaic artist could feel the empire's long, slow shifting in ways that were not dramatic, yet unmistakable. The markets were still open, the forums still filled with voices, and the baths still echoed with conversation, but there was a different undercurrent now. One of weariness, of a city and a people aware that their golden age was behind them. Fewer grand commissions came from the wealthiest patrons, and more requests arrived from smaller households, from shopkeepers or retired soldiers who wanted a modest floor or a small wall panel to mark a special place in their homes. He welcomed these works as much as any great project, for he had learned that a simple border pattern in a modest dining room could hold just as much care and pride as the most elaborate scene in a senator's villa. In the streets, he noticed the presence of more foreign accents, merchants and travelers from places that had once seemed distant, now drawn into the city's orbit as the empire's edges shifted. News from the provinces came slowly, often carried by those who had seen the roads grow less safe, the legions more stretched. Sometimes an apprentice would ask him if the empire would last forever, and he would only smile faintly, knowing that no empire ever truly did, but that some works of human hands could endure longer than the walls around them. His own health had begun to change. His knees ached more after a day's work, and his sight required him to bring the tesserae closer to inspect the smallest details. Still, he persisted, for his craft was as much a part of him as breathing. He continued to train young artisans, urging them to work with patience, to never hurry the placing of a stone, and to think always about how their work would be seen centuries from now. There were days when he visited villas where he had worked decades earlier, and he would see his mosaics still intact, their colors only slightly faded, the patterns still clear beneath the dust of time. He would kneel, run his hand over the smooth surface, and feel a quiet satisfaction, knowing that these pieces had witnessed feasts, celebrations, and quiet conversations long after his own footsteps had left. The city might change, the empire might shift, but in these mosaics, there was a kind of stillness, a defiance against the rush of time. He began to think of his life not as a series of separate projects, but as one long mosaic of its own. Each year a tessera, each journey a fragment of color, each friendship and each work completed a piece that fit into the greater whole. And as he looked back, he saw that what had once been a lifetime of labor was also a lifetime of art, shaped by his hands but also by the world around him, a pattern he would continue to build for as long as his strength allowed. As the seasons passed and the years began to weigh gently on his shoulders, the mosaic artist found himself spending more time teaching than working, though his hands never fully left the tools. Younger craftsmen now filled the workshop benches, their heads bent over fresh designs, the sound of cutting stone mingling with quiet conversation. He moved among them slowly, offering a word of advice here, adjusting the angle of a tessera there, always with the same patient care he had shown his own apprentices decades before. He knew that his strength was not what it had been, that his eyes tired more quickly, but he also knew that the knowledge he carried was too valuable to be kept to himself. And so he poured it into the next generation, telling them not only about the craft, but about the life that surrounded it. How to work with difficult patrons without losing one's dignity, how to choose materials that would endure even when budgets were modest, how to travel with tools carefully packed so that they would be ready to work upon arrival in a distant town. In quieter moments, he would sit at the same work table where he had once labored from dawn to dusk and sketch designs that he might never complete, patterns inspired by memories, the curve of a river he had seen in Hispania, the bright feathers of a bird in North Africa, the geometry of shadows on a Roman colonnade in the late afternoon. These designs he shared freely with his apprentices, urging them to take the ideas and make them their own. Outside, the city continued to shift in ways he could not ignore. The Forum still held markets, but some stalls stood empty longer than they once had. The public baths, once bustling, now closed earlier to save on fuel for the fires. Friends spoke quietly of uncertainty, of taxes heavier than before, of neighbors moving away. Yet within his workshop, there was still the same steady rhythm, the same sense of purpose in the careful alignment of stone and glass. His former apprentices, now masters themselves, sometimes returned to visit, bringing news of mosaics completed in far-off towns, of commissions from wealthy families in the countryside, of restoration work that revealed fragments of floors laid in the time of his own master. These visits filled him with a gentle pride, for they were proof that the craft he had given his life to was alive and well beyond his own hands. On days when the light was soft and the air was cool, he would take slow walks to places where his work lay hidden beneath the daily life of the city. A villa floor seen only when a rug was lifted, a temple apse where worshippers stood on stone images of gods, a fountain wall still catching the sunlight on pieces of gold glass he had set long ago. These quiet visits reminded him that his life's work was not about recognition, but about leaving behind something that would continue to bring beauty and order to the world long after he was gone. And in the faces of the apprentices around him, he could already see the future of the craft, each of them a living piece of the long, unbroken mosaic he had helped to shape. In what would become the final chapter of his working life, the mosaic artist began to feel the natural slowing that comes with age, though his mind remained sharp and his love for the craft undiminished. The days were shorter now, not because the sun had changed its path, but because his body asked for more rest between the hours of work. He no longer began at dawn. Instead, he would arrive in the workshop mid-morning, greeted by the warm scent of lime and stone dust, and the quiet hum of activity as his apprentices continued their projects. Much of his time was spent observing, offering guidance in the way a gardener tends to young plants, careful not to overstep, but always ready to lend support when needed. He found himself telling more stories than before, recounting the days when he traveled across the provinces, the long weeks spent in foreign villas, the first time he was entrusted with a large commission. These stories were not told with pride or longing, but with a kind of gentle clarity, as if placing them in the air allowed them to settle where they belonged. Sometimes an apprentice would bring him a nearly finished panel and ask for his opinion, and he would run his hand lightly over the surface, feeling for evenness, scanning for harmony in the colors. He rarely made changes himself now, preferring instead to suggest adjustments, trusting them to learn by doing. Outside the workshop, the city continued its slow transformation. Streets he had walked for decades now bore new buildings where old ones had stood. While some familiar landmarks had fallen into disrepair, he would sometimes pause before a mosaic he had laid years ago, marveling at how it still held its pattern despite the countless feet that had passed over it. There was comfort in knowing that something as fragile as a small piece of glass or stone, when placed with care and purpose, could survive far longer than anyone expected. More and more, he thought about the future of the workshop and the apprentices who would carry it forward. He had no children of his own, but in a way, each of his students had become part of his family, bound not by blood, but by the shared language of the craft. One in particular, a young man with steady hands and a keen eye for detail, had begun to take on more responsibility, quietly earning the respect of the others. The artist saw in him the patience and dedication that the work demanded, and he knew that one day the workshop would be his to guide. In the evenings, he would walk home slowly, the sky fading into deep blues and golds, reflecting on the fact that his life had been measured not by years alone, but by the countless small acts of creation he had left behind. Each mosaic was a chapter, each tessera a word, and together they formed a story that could be read by anyone willing to look closely. As the seasons turned, he felt no bitterness about the approach of his final years at the bench. Instead, there was a quiet readiness, an understanding that the work would go on without him, and that in the hands of those he had taught, the language of stone and color would continue to speak long after his own voice had faded. The final months of his working life came not with any sudden announcement, but with a gradual easing of pace, as though both he and the workshop had silently agreed it was time. He no longer took on new commissions himself, instead overseeing the projects chosen and managed by his apprentices, stepping in only when a particularly delicate section called for the steady touch of his hand. The mornings began with him seated at the large central table, sipping a cup of watered wine while reviewing sketches brought to him for approval. He would point out where a line might flow more gracefully, where a color shift could bring a scene to life, or where a pattern might need a touch more balance. The young artisans listened closely. Their respect for him deepened, not just by his mastery of the craft, but by the calm, patient way he shared it. He spent more time now simply watching them work, the sounds of tapping tools and the faint crunch of stone underfoot filling the air, the scent of mortar a familiar comfort. Occasionally he would pick up a tessera, turn it in his fingers, and set it gently into place, not because it was needed, but because it reminded him of the feel of the work he had loved for so long. Outside, the seasons turned with their usual quiet rhythm. Spring brought fresh light into the workshop. Summer heat carried the scent of dust through the open doors. Autumn leaves scattered across the threshold, and winter's chill made the warmth of the kiln all the more welcome. In those last working days, he often found himself reflecting on the journey from his first hesitant steps as an apprentice to this moment, a lifetime spent in service to a craft that demanded both precision and patience. He thought of the countless floors, walls, and fountains he had adorned, the distant towns and provinces he had visited, the patrons whose faces had faded from memory, even as their commissions endured. What he felt most strongly was not pride in individual works, but gratitude for having been part of something that connected him to generations past and future. He took quiet satisfaction in knowing that his mosaics had become part of the daily life of others, walked upon without thought, glanced at in passing, serving their purpose without demanding attention. In this way, they mirrored the life he had chosen, steady, enduring, and quietly essential. As the days grew shorter, he began preparing the workshop for his absence, organizing tools, labeling jars of pigments, and making sure each stack of stone was sorted by size and color. He spoke with the apprentice who would take over, offering final pieces of advice, not in long speeches, but in the simple, careful observations that had always been his way. And when he finally decided that a certain panel, a small geometric floor design, would be his last. He worked on it slowly, savoring each placement of stone, each line of the pattern, until it was complete. When he set down his tools at the end of that day, there was no ceremony, no applause, only the quiet knowledge that his work was done, and that the workshop would continue to hum with life without him. When the day finally came for him to leave the workshop behind, it arrived without fanfare, as quietly as the dawn that spread its first light across the city. He rose later than usual, dressed in his well-worn tunic, and walked the familiar streets at an unhurried pace, his steps echoing softly on the stone. The workshop doors stood open, as they always had, the warm light spilling out into the street and the familiar scent of mortar and stone dust greeting him like an old friend. Inside, his apprentices were already at work, their movements steady, their voices low, the rhythm of the craft carrying on as if it had always been theirs. He moved through the space slowly, pausing to touch the smooth handles of the tools he had held for decades, to run his fingers over the sorted trays of tesserae, to glance at the sketches pinned neatly to the walls. Each detail was a fragment of the life he had built here, each surface carrying the memory of long hours spent in patient labor. The apprentice who would now guide the workshop looked up from his work, their eyes meeting in a moment of quiet understanding. Nothing needed to be said. He stayed for a time, offering small suggestions, sharing one last story about a commission from many years ago, his voice gentle and even. When the midday sun began to angle through the high windows, he knew it was time. He gathered his cloak, stepped into the doorway, and turned once more to take in the sight of the place that had been both his livelihood and his refuge. The air outside was cool, the city alive with the sounds of daily life, but he walked without hurry, letting the streets carry him toward home. In the days that followed, he found himself with more time than he had known in years. He visited old friends, strolled to the river, and spent afternoons watching the sunlight shift across the tiled courtyards of public buildings, some of them laid with mosaics he recognized as his own. There was a deep comfort in knowing that these works would remain, perhaps for generations, their patterns holding steady against the slow erosion of time. He no longer needed to place the stones himself to feel connected to the craft. It was enough to know that others were carrying it forward, each new piece a continuation of the long mosaic he had helped to build. As the seasons passed, he grew older still, his steps slower, his days quieter, yet his mind often wandered back to the feel of a tessera between his fingers, the soft press into wet mortar, the satisfaction of seeing a design come to life. And when his time finally came to an end, it was said that his apprentices laid a small mosaic in his memory. Nothing grand, just a simple pattern of interlocking shapes, set into the floor near the entrance of the workshop. Those who stepped across it in the years that followed may not have known whose hands had once guided so many others, but they walked over his work, all the same, carrying his legacy forward with every footstep. In this way, the life of the mosaic artist did not truly end. It lived on in the countless patterns and images scattered across cities and provinces, in the hands of those he had taught, and in the quiet, enduring beauty of a craft that, like the man himself, had withstood the passage of time. That was the end of our story. Before we begin the next one, I would be so grateful if you could give me a like and a subscribe. And now, let us continue with another chapter in our Boring History for Sleep series, as we step softly into what it was like to grow old in ancient Athens. In the sunlit city of Athens, where the marble temples caught the first light of dawn and the narrow streets echoed with the footsteps of merchants, philosophers, and citizens, the process of growing old was shaped as much by custom and expectation as by the slow passage of years. To live to old age in ancient Athens was, in itself, a mark of fortune, for many lives were cut short by illness, war, or accident. Those who reached their later years carried with them the weight of experience and the visible signs of time: silver hair, slower steps, and the careful movements of a body that had seen decades of labor, festivals, and seasons of change. Life for the elderly was woven into the fabric of the city, for Athens valued the counsel of those who had lived through its triumphs and its trials. Men who had once served as soldiers or rowers in the fleet might now be found seated in shaded corners of the agora, sharing quiet conversations about politics, trade, or the affairs of their families. Women who had long managed the running of households, raising children and overseeing servants, often turn their attention to guiding younger generations, passing down recipes, household wisdom, and the stories of ancestors. Old age brought a shift in daily rhythm. The rush of youth gave way to slower mornings, visits to friends, and time spent in the comfort of home. The laws of Athens recognized the role of the elderly in both family and civic life. Sons were expected to care for their aging parents, providing food, shelter, and respect, a duty reinforced by both legal obligation and the deep-rooted social belief in honoring one's elders. Failure to do so could lead to public shame or even legal action, for neglecting an elderly parent was considered a serious offense. For many older Athenians, this meant they could live out their days surrounded by family, though the quality of that care depended greatly on the fortunes of their household. Wealthier citizens might spend their later years in comfortable homes with courtyards and servants, enjoying wine and bread in the afternoon shade, while those of humbler means continued to work in small ways, tending gardens, selling goods at the market, or helping with simple household tasks. Public life did not always fade with age. Some elders served as advisors in political matters or offered their voices in the assembly, their words carrying the weight of decades. Others found purpose in the city's many religious festivals, participating in rituals, processions, and offerings to the gods, for piety was seen as a lifelong duty. The city itself offered certain honors to the elderly, particularly to those who had served it faithfully. Veterans of past wars might be granted seats of honor at public events, and some festivals included roles reserved for the oldest citizens, symbolic of the wisdom and continuity they represent. Yet old age in Athens was not without hardship. Illness and infirmity were common, and medical care was limited to the knowledge of local physicians, herbal remedies, and the prayers offered at healing temples. Some elders, especially those without surviving family, lived modestly, relying on neighbors or the goodwill of fellow citizens. Still, there was a certain dignity in the way Athens regarded its elders, not as a burden to be hidden away, but as living witnesses to the city's history, keepers of memory who could recall times and events that the young knew only through stories. To grow old in Athens was to move at a different pace, to watch the city continue its life around you while finding contentment in quieter pleasures, in the laughter of grandchildren, in the warmth of the sun on stone, and in the knowledge that you had played your part in the long story of the city by the sea. For an elderly Athenian, the rhythms of daily life were shaped by both personal habit and the seasonal flow of the city. Mornings often began early, not with the rush of youth to the fields or workshops, but with a slower rising, perhaps accompanied by the sounds of vendors setting up their stalls in the agora or the distant echo of hammers from a stonemason's yard. A simple breakfast of bread, dipped in wine or honey, might be taken in the courtyard, where the sunlight filtered through grapevines or fig branches, casting gentle patterns on the stone. For those whose legs remained strong, a walk to the marketplace or a visit to a public fountain served as both exercise and an opportunity for conversation. The agora, with its colonnades and shaded corners, was more than a place of trade. It was the heart of Athenian public life, and older men in particular found in it a place to exchange news, share opinions on political matters, and observe the bustle of the city. Women whose lives were more centered around the home might receive visits from relatives or neighbors, using these moments to pass on advice, share stories, or help prepare for an upcoming festival. Religious observance was an integral part of life, and older citizens often played important roles in rituals, bringing offerings to temples or taking part in processions during the city's many festivals. The sense of connection to the gods did not diminish with age. If anything, it deepened, as elders reflected on the cycles of fortune and misfortune they had witnessed. For some, particularly veterans of the city's past wars, there was a quiet pride in attending public events where seats of honor were reserved for those who had once defended Athens. These occasions served as reminders that their service was remembered, even if their names were no longer widely known. Family ties remained central, and in well-off households, older parents or grandparents often lived under the same roof as their children and grandchildren, their presence a steady influence in the home. They might tell tales of past generations, teach a boy the old songs sung at symposia, or instruct a girl in the proper way to weave a pattern into cloth. In poorer households, life could be more demanding. Elders might still help with small tasks like tending animals, preparing food, or mending clothing, their labor contributing to the family's survival. Despite the city's respect for its elders, not every old age was easy. The aches of the body were felt more keenly, and for those without strong family ties, loneliness could weigh heavily. Yet the communal nature of Athenian society offered some comfort. Neighbors knew each other's names, and help could sometimes be found in the small kindnesses of those nearby. The afternoons were often quiet, with the heat encouraging rest in shaded rooms or under porticos, and evenings brought a gentle cooling, when the city once again filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and conversation. For the elderly, these hours were as much about listening as speaking, watching the younger generations carry forward the life of Athens, while knowing that their own part in that story was already written in the memories of family, the stones of the city, and the unbroken traditions that had guided them through decades of change. In the eyes of many Athenians, old age was closely linked with wisdom, for it was believed that years of living through the city's triumphs and defeats, its seasons of prosperity and hardship, gave elders a perspective that the young could not yet possess. This belief was reflected in the way older men were sometimes sought out for counsel, whether in matters of family, commerce, or politics. In the assembly, where decisions about war, trade, and law were made, it was not uncommon for an older citizen to rise and speak, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent watching the city's fortunes rise and fall. Though not every elder held a formal position of power, their influence often rested in quieter forms: a well-timed word to a neighbor, advice given to a younger relative about the risks of a venture, or a reminder of how similar situations had unfolded in the past. For women, wisdom was shared more often within the walls of the home, where mothers and grandmothers shaped the habits, manners, and values of the next generation. A girl might learn from her grandmother not only how to spin and weave, but how to read the subtle cues of a guest's behavior, how to prepare for a festival day, or how to manage a household's resources through leaner times. Storytelling was another way in which the wisdom of elders found its place in daily life. In the evenings, as the streets cooled and oil lamps were lit, an older man might recount the battles of Marathon or Salamis to eager young listeners, weaving the names of heroes and generals into a narrative that was part history, part lesson in courage and loyalty. Others would tell myths, not simply as entertainment, but as moral examples. Cautionary tales about hubris, generosity, or the rewards of perseverance. These stories were repeated often enough that their lessons became part of the listener's own thinking, guiding them in ways they might not even notice. Memory itself was a valued skill in Athens, where much of the city's cultural and civic knowledge was preserved through spoken word. Older citizens who could recall genealogies, public events, and the proper forms of religious rites held an important role in ensuring continuity from one generation to the next. Their recollections tied the present to the past, reminding younger Athenians that they were part of a story stretching back through centuries. Respect for elders was reinforced by the city's customs and laws, but it was also sustained by the recognition that their experience was irreplaceable. Yet this respect did not mean that age was free from challenge. At times, younger citizens might dismiss the advice of elders as overly cautious or rooted in traditions that no longer fit a changing world. Even so, the presence of the elderly in public and private life served as a constant reminder that the city was built not only by the energy of the young, but by the steady hands and measured thoughts of those who had come before. To grow old in Athens was to accept a different kind of role, less active perhaps, but deeply woven into the fabric of the community, a living link between memory and the unfolding future. For the elderly in ancient Athens, festivals and religious rituals were among the most meaningful moments of the year, offering not only a sense of participation in the city's spiritual life, but also a reminder of belonging to a community that valued continuity between generations. Athens was a city of many festivals, each tied to a particular deity or season. And for older citizens, these occasions carried layers of memory, the echo of processions they had walked in their youth, the scent of incense rising before the same altars, the chants and hymns that had accompanied them since childhood. Elders often played symbolic roles in these celebrations. At certain festivals, places of honor were reserved for the oldest men in the community, seats close to the action where they could watch the performances, sacrifices, or athletic games that formed part of the event. Their presence was not merely ceremonial. It served as a living reminder of the city's endurance, the link between its past and its present. Women, too, participated in ways shaped by their age and experience. Older women might lead younger ones in preparing offerings for the gods, weaving garlands or mixing honeyed cakes for ritual use. In some festivals, they carried sacred objects in processions, a task entrusted to those whose lives were considered virtuous and worthy. For the Panathenaea, the great festival in honor of Athena, older women often took part in weaving the peplos, a robe for the goddess's statue, a process that began months in advance and drew on skills passed down through generations. Such work allowed them to contribute directly to one of the city's most important religious acts, reinforcing their connection to both the divine and the civic identity of Athens. For older men who had served as soldiers, certain festivals also brought moments of recognition. They might march, albeit slowly, in processions that honored past victories, their presence a tribute to the battles they had survived and the service they had given. The young would see them and be reminded of the sacrifices required to keep the city strong. Beyond the grand public occasions, there were smaller religious observances that shaped the rhythm of an elder's life. Household rites performed at family altars, offerings left at roadside shrines, prayers whispered before setting out on a journey. These daily acts of devotion were as significant to the elderly as the great festivals, for they provided a sense of order, of the world being properly aligned with the gods. Participation in religious life also served as a social bond, bringing together neighbors and relatives in shared acts of piety. Even those too frail to walk long distances could sit in a shaded spot along the route of a procession, offering their blessings to those who passed by. In this way, old age did not mean withdrawal from public life, but rather a shift in how one engaged with it, moving from active physical participation to the offering of presence, memory, and moral authority. For the elders of Athens, the festivals were not only celebrations of the city's patron deities, but affirmations of their own place within the unbroken chain of Athenian life, stretching backward into the memories of their ancestors and forward into the lives of their descendants. Leisure in the later years of life in ancient Athens was a quieter, more reflective affair, shaped by the slower rhythms of the body and the deeper appreciation for the small and familiar pleasures of each day. For many elders, companionship was one of the most valued aspects of this stage of life, whether it came in the form of family gathered under the same roof, neighbors whose doorways had faced each other for decades, or friends met in shaded corners of the agora. Men might spend their mornings strolling slowly along the colonnades, stopping to watch craftsmen at work or to exchange news with acquaintances. Their conversations ranging from the latest political developments to memories of past festivals and long-gone leaders. Some found enjoyment in watching the training grounds where the youth exercised, seeing in their energy a reflection of their own younger selves. Women, whose days were more centered around the household, often found their leisure in the company of other women, helping with small tasks while talking over family matters or recalling shared moments from the past. In the warm months, many older Athenians enjoyed sitting in the shade of a courtyard or under a vine-covered pergola, where the air was scented with herbs and flowers, the sounds of the city softened by the rustle of leaves. A simple cup of diluted wine, a handful of olives, or a slice of fresh bread could become an occasion when shared with good company. Storytelling was a favored pastime, and elders took pride in passing on both personal anecdotes and the larger tales of the city's history. For some, leisure also included small acts of continued work that brought satisfaction without the strain of heavy labor, tending a small garden, repairing household items, or preparing offerings for the household shrine. These activities kept the hands busy while allowing the mind to wander freely. Philosophical discussion was another form of enjoyment for those with the inclination and education for it. In Athens, a city that prized thought and debate, older men might still gather in public spaces to discuss questions of ethics, governance, or the nature of the gods. Their voices slower, but their reasoning sharpened by years of observation. For others, leisure meant attending the theater, where comedies and tragedies offered both entertainment and reflection on the human condition. While not all elders could manage the walk to the theater of Dionysus, those who could made the effort, knowing the experience of live performance, connected them to the wider civic life of the city. In the evenings, the cooler air brought renewed activity. Neighbors might gather outside their homes, the conversation drifting easily between light-hearted banter, and the sharing of old stories. Children played nearby, occasionally drawn into the tales or sent on small errands for the elders. These moments reinforced the sense of belonging that was so central to Athenian life. The knowledge that one's later years were not spent in isolation, but as part of a living community. To grow old in Athens was to understand that leisure was not the absence of purpose, but the enjoyment of time shaped by choice, by memory, and by the gentle presence of those who shared the same streets, the same festivals, and the same long history. The challenges of aging in ancient Athens were felt in ways both universal and particular to the time. For while the city valued its elders, the realities of declining health and physical strength could not be avoided. Medical knowledge was limited to the skills of local physicians, herbalists, and the advice of those who had seen many illnesses before. Remedies were drawn from plants, oils, and simple practices, sometimes guided by the teachings of Hippocrates, whose ideas about balance and diet influenced how Athenians approached well-being. Yet for many older citizens, ailments such as joint pain, weakened eyesight, or the lingering effects of past injuries were accepted as an inevitable part of life. Wealthier households could afford more attentive care, perhaps hiring servants to assist with daily needs or consulting physicians more often, while those with fewer resources relied heavily on family members for help. Sons and daughters were expected by law and custom to provide for their aging parents, ensuring they had food, shelter, and dignity. Neglecting this duty was not only frowned upon socially, but could bring legal consequences, for the Athenians saw the care of elders as a moral and civic obligation. Still, the level of support varied, and in some cases, elders without family or close neighbors faced more difficult circumstances, living modestly and depending on the goodwill of their community. Public assistance was limited, but there were occasional measures to help those who had served the city in meaningful ways. Veterans, for example, might receive some form of sustenance or recognition, and those who had held certain public offices could be honored with privileges that eased their later years. Religious life also offered comfort in times of frailty, with elders visiting healing sanctuaries dedicated to gods like Asclepius, where rituals, prayers, and symbolic cures provided not only hope for physical relief, but also a sense of spiritual reassurance. The city's layout, with its hills, uneven streets, and busy public spaces, could make movement challenging for those whose strength had waned. So many elders spent more time within familiar neighborhoods or courtyards, where daily life could be managed at a gentler pace. Despite the physical limitations, there was a strong emphasis on maintaining engagement with the world. Friends visited each other's homes, neighbors brought news or shared food, and elders were still invited to social gatherings, even if they could not participate as actively as before. These connections acted as a safeguard against the loneliness that could otherwise accompany old age. Some elders took comfort in mentoring the young, finding purpose in teaching trades, recounting history, or guiding moral choices. Others drew strength from the rituals of daily life, pouring libations at dawn, tending a small altar, or sitting quietly in the sun while the city moved around them. Though the body might slow, the mind and spirit could remain sharp. And for many Athenians, the later years became a time for reflection, for finding peace in the knowledge that they had contributed to the life of their family and their city. In this way, even the difficulties of aging were met with a measure of dignity, shaped by the belief that every stage of life held its place in the larger order of things. In ancient Athens, the final stage of life was approached with a blend of practicality, tradition, and deep respect for the place of elders in the ongoing story of the city. Death was understood not as an interruption, but as the natural closing of a life cycle. And for those who had lived to old age, it was often met with acceptance rather than fear. Preparations for death began long before the final days, woven into the customs of the household and the duties of the family. Elders often made arrangements for their burial in advance, choosing the site of their grave and ensuring that their wishes for the funeral rites were known. The Athenians saw burial as both a sacred duty and a public statement of honor, and the responsibility for carrying it out fell to the family, especially the sons. The prothesis, or laying out of the body, took place at home, where relatives and friends could come to pay their respects, offering quiet words and simple gestures of farewell. The deceased was washed, anointed with oil, and dressed in clean garments, sometimes with tokens or small possessions placed beside them. The funeral procession, or ekphora, would then carry the body to the place of burial, often outside the city walls along roads lined with monuments and markers from generations past. Elders who had served the city with distinction might have more elaborate memorials, while others rested beneath simpler stones inscribed with their names and perhaps an image or symbol reflecting their life. For the family, the burial was only the beginning of remembrance. Offerings of food, wine, and wreaths were made at the grave, not only in the days immediately following the funeral, but at regular intervals throughout the year, ensuring that the dead remained part of the family's ongoing life. For older Athenians, the knowledge that they would be honored in this way brought a measure of peace in their final years. The city itself reinforced this sense of continuity. Walking along the roads leading out of Athens, one would pass countless grave markers, each telling a story in stone. A woman seated with her hand clasped by a loved one, a warrior standing in armor, a young athlete holding a discus. These images served as reminders that the past was never far away, that the lives of those who had gone before still shaped the living. In their last years, many elders took comfort in telling their stories to children and grandchildren, ensuring that memories would outlive the stone markers. The concept of kleos, or enduring reputation, was not reserved only for warriors and statesmen. In its quieter form, it applied to anyone whose life had been lived with honor, kindness, and devotion to family and community. In this way, death was not the end of an elder's role in Athens, but the beginning of their place in the collective memory, a legacy carried forward in stories, in customs, and in the very fabric of the city's life. And so, to grow old in Athens was to know that, when the time came, one's life would be remembered. Not in grand speeches for most, but in the daily acts of remembrance that tied each generation to those who had come before. The memory of elders in ancient Athens was not simply a matter of personal affection within families. It was woven into the broader cultural identity of the city, influencing how younger generations understood themselves and their place in the world. The stories, teachings, and examples left behind by those who had lived long lives were carried forward in countless ways, in the way a festival was celebrated, in the manner a household arranged its offerings to the gods, in the customs observed during marriages or births. Young Athenians grew up hearing the voices of their elders in moments of guidance, remembering phrases repeated so often that they became part of the family's shared language. These lessons, drawn from a lifetime of experience, often emphasized virtues such as moderation, loyalty, and respect for the city's laws. In public life, the influence of elders could be seen in the cautious strategies adopted during times of crisis, when leaders who had themselves been shaped by older mentors remembered the advice to think beyond immediate gain. Even in the arts, the legacy of elders was present. Poets and dramatists often drew upon stories recounted by older citizens, preserving in verse and performance the values and experiences of earlier generations. A playwright might weave into his chorus lines of an old proverb, confident that the audience would recognize it as a truth passed down through time. Sculptors and painters sometimes depicted elderly figures in their work, not as symbols of frailty, but as embodiments of wisdom and stability. In the home, objects belonging to departed elders were treasured, a cup used daily by a grandfather, a weaving loom handled by a grandmother, a small figurine or amulet that had sat on a household shrine for decades. These tangible connections to the past were not seen as relics to be locked away, but as living parts of the household, reminders that each generation was part of an unbroken chain. In the city at large, the role of elders as keepers of memory ensured that certain traditions remained steady even as other aspects of life evolved. The way a sacrifice was conducted at a temple, the proper order of speeches at a public gathering, the exact path taken during a procession. These details often survived because someone older had insisted on passing them down. For younger Athenians, growing up in the presence of such memory created a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. It encouraged them to think of their own lives not only in terms of personal achievement, but as contributions to the ongoing story of the city. In this way, the memory of elders was not confined to the past. It actively shaped the present and laid the groundwork for the future. The wisdom they left behind, whether in words, in customs, or in example, was like a quiet current running beneath the surface of Athenian life, guiding decisions, shaping values, and reminding each new generation that they, too, would one day be the voices that others looked to for guidance. When considering what it meant to grow old in Athens, it is helpful to see how the city's attitudes and customs compared with those of other Greek city-states. For while all shared a common Hellenic heritage, the place of elders in society could differ greatly depending on local traditions, laws, and values. In Athens, old age was linked strongly with civic memory, democratic participation, and the gentle authority of experience. And while not every elder was wealthy or influential, there was an underlying respect for those who had lived long enough to contribute decades of service to the city's life. By contrast, in Sparta, the role of elders was defined more sharply by the militaristic structure of society. Spartan men who reached the age of 60 and had completed a lifetime of military service were eligible to join the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, a powerful body that advised the kings and played a decisive role in shaping laws and policies. In this way, old age in Sparta could bring significant political authority, though it was reserved for a select few whose lives had met the rigorous demands of the state. In other city-states, such as Corinth or Thebes, the treatment of the elderly was shaped by a mix of local economy, family structure, and civic pride. Wealth and property often determined how comfortably an elder could live, with prosperous merchants or landowners enjoying a more secure old age than those who had worked as laborers. In rural areas across the Greek world, elders were deeply embedded in the agricultural cycle, offering advice on planting and harvests, managing estates, and preserving farming techniques that had been refined over generations. In many places, the religious duties of elders were also important, for temples and sanctuaries often relied on older citizens to oversee rituals, maintain sacred objects, or serve as witnesses to oaths and agreements. While Athens was not unique in valuing its elders, its democratic system allowed even ordinary older citizens to have a voice in the assembly, a level of civic involvement that was less common elsewhere. This meant that in Athens, the aging process was tied not only to family and household, but also to an ongoing engagement with public life, even if participation lessened with declining health. Visitors from other cities sometimes remarked on the visibility of older men in Athenian public spaces, sitting in shaded areas of the agora, debating matters of state, or simply observing the life of the city. This visibility reinforced the idea that elders were part of the city's living identity, rather than quietly withdrawn from it. Across the Greek world, respect for the elderly was encouraged through shared cultural values, but it was in Athens that this respect was most closely tied to the ideals of civic duty and collective memory. By seeing how Athens compared to its neighbors, one can better understand why growing old there carried a particular blend of personal dignity, public involvement, and connection to the city's unfolding story, a combination that gave the later years of life both meaning and place. To reflect on what it was like to grow old in ancient Athens is to see a portrait of aging shaped by community, tradition, and the enduring connection between the individual and the life of the city. For Athenians, the later years were not a separate chapter cut off from the rest of life, but a continuation of the same story, now told in a quieter voice. Old age brought changes in the body, in the pace of daily life, and in one's role within the household, yet it also offered a vantage point from which to see the city in its full span. The streets and buildings that had risen and changed over decades, the festivals that returned each year like familiar friends, the faces of younger generations carrying forward the customs and habits passed down to them. In Athens, the elderly were not hidden away from public view. They walked through the agora, sat in shaded porticos, attended the theater, and took their places at religious processions, each presence a reminder that the city's present was built on the foundation of its past. Family ties formed the backbone of care and companionship, but public life offered its own forms of belonging, whether through the right to speak in the assembly, the honor of seats reserved at civic events, or the shared memory of battles, victories, and hard lessons learned. The Athenians understood that while youth built and fought and carried the city forward in visible ways, the wisdom of age offered balance, caution, and perspective. The respect shown to elders was not only a matter of courtesy, it was an acknowledgement that their lives were part of the city's long memory, and that each older citizen had, in their own way, contributed to the shaping of Athens. Death, when it came, was met with rituals that ensured the individual would remain part of the community's story. a name carved in stone, offerings made at the grave, stories told to the young. In this way, the Athenian view of old age carried a lesson that still resonates, that the value of a life is measured not only in achievements, but in the quiet persistence of presence, in the care given to others, and in the traditions upheld. To grow old in Athens was to find meaning in being both witness and participant, to live within a web of relationships that stretched backward into the memory of ancestors and forward into the hopes of descendants. Even in the face of the inevitable limitations of age, there was dignity in knowing one's life remained woven into the city's fabric, not as a relic of the past, but as a living thread in the ongoing tapestry of Athenian life. And so the story of growing old in ancient Athens is not just about a time long gone. It is about the timeless human desire to remain connected, to be remembered, and to know that one's place in the world, however modest, is part of something enduring. That was the end of our story. Before we begin the next one, I would be so grateful if you could give me a like and a subscribe. And now, let us continue with another chapter in our Boring History for Sleep series, as we quietly turn the page to the monks who copied books for centuries. Long before the invention of the printing press, when every book in the world had to be made by hand, there were men who devoted their lives to the quiet, patient labor of copying words onto parchment, ensuring that the knowledge of centuries would not be lost. These were the monks of medieval Europe, who lived in monasteries where the rhythm of life was measured not by the clock, but by the tolling of bells that called them to prayer, to work, and to study. In these communities, the scriptorium, a large, well-lit room or a series of smaller chambers, served as the center of manuscript production. Here, rows of wooden desks held sheets of prepared parchment, pots of ink, and carefully sharpened quills made from goose or swan feathers. The work was exacting and required both physical endurance and mental focus. A single mistake could mean hours of scraping the parchment clean with a small knife before rewriting the line. The monks began their days early, often rising before sunrise for the first prayers of the day, and only after this spiritual beginning did they take their places at the desks. The process of making a book was slow and deliberate. The parchment had to be smoothed and cut to size, the lines ruled with a stylus to guide the writing, and the text copied letter by letter, word by word, from another manuscript. There was no room for haste. A large work, such as a complete Bible, could take years to finish, and many hands might contribute to it over that time. Illumination, the art of decorating the pages with gold, silver, and colorful pigments, added further time and complexity. Some monks specialized in this, creating intricate initials and borders filled with twisting vines, tiny animals, and scenes from scripture. The colors came from natural sources: lapis lazuli for deep blue, vermilion from cinnabar for red, and green from malachite, each ground into powder and mixed with egg whites or gum to create paint. The scriptorium was kept quiet, the only sounds being the scratching of quills, the rustle of parchment, and the occasional murmured word as a scribe checked his work. In winter, the rooms could be cold, and the ink might thicken in its pot, requiring warming before it could flow smoothly again. In summer, the light was better, but the heat could make concentration harder. Yet through the changing seasons, the work continued, for copying books was considered a form of devotion, an offering of time and skill to God, as well as a way to preserve the wisdom of the past for future generations. Some of the texts were religious, including scripture, sermons, and writings of the Church Fathers, but others covered subjects such as history, medicine, philosophy, and astronomy. By copying these works, the monks ensured that ideas from ancient Greece and Rome, as well as from more recent scholars, would survive the turbulent centuries of medieval Europe. A single manuscript might pass through many monasteries in its lifetime, each adding marginal notes or corrections, each scribe leaving behind traces of his hand in the shapes of letters or the style of decoration. Though their names were often forgotten, the work of these monks formed an unbroken chain of knowledge, carrying words across time in the careful strokes of a quill. The life of a monk scribe was shaped by a strict daily routine, where the hours of writing were carefully balanced with the rhythms of prayer, study, and simple manual labor. In most monasteries, the day began before dawn, when the ringing of the matin bell called the brothers from their beds to the chapel for the first service of the day. The air at that hour was often cold, and the stone floors chilled their bare feet as they walked in silence to join the community in chanting psalms. After the early prayers, there might be a short meal of bread and watered wine, or sometimes just a warm drink to steady the body for the work ahead. The scribes would then move to the scriptorium, where their places at the long wooden desks had been prepared the day before. Light was essential, so seats were arranged near tall, narrow windows that allowed the morning sun to fall across the parchment. In winter, when the days were shorter, candles or oil lamps were placed nearby, but their flickering light could strain the eyes, making mistakes more likely. Each monk worked with the tools of his trade close at hand. The quills he had cut and sharpened himself, a small knife for scraping away errors, a pumice stone to smooth the parchment, and a ruler or stylus to mark the lines. The ink was often made within the monastery, a mixture of oak gall, iron salts, and gum, producing a deep black that would last for centuries. Writing was not rushed. Each letter was formed with deliberate care, the scribe pausing often to compare his copy with the original manuscript. Any change in handwriting, however small, could be noticed by the trained eye, so the monk kept his strokes steady and uniform, even when the work stretched for hours. Around midday, the bell would ring again, calling the community to the chapel for another service, after which they would share a simple meal, often in silence, listening to a reading from scripture or a text of moral instruction. The afternoon brought more hours at the desk, the work continuing until the light began to fade. Monks were trained to guard their concentration against distraction, and silence was strictly observed in the scriptorium, with communication limited to hand gestures or brief murmurs when absolutely necessary. In some monasteries, the writing benches were designed with slanted tops, allowing the scribe to work more comfortably for long stretches, though even with such arrangements, the work could be physically demanding. The neck, shoulders, and eyes often grew tired, and the cold of winter could stiffen the fingers. But the discipline of the monastic life meant that complaints were rare. For the monk, copying a book was not simply a mechanical task. It was a spiritual exercise. Each word, each sentence, was approached with reverence, especially when the text was scripture. Many believed that the act of preserving these words was as valuable as preaching them aloud, for the written page would carry the message far beyond the walls of the monastery and long beyond the lifetime of the scribe. In this way, the labor of writing was both humble and profound, a daily act of devotion that linked the monk to the generations of scribes before him and to those yet to come, all part of an unbroken chain of guardianship over the written word. Before a monk could begin the careful work of copying a text, the materials for the manuscript had to be prepared, and this process was as much a part of the craft as the writing itself. The most essential of these materials was parchment, made from the skins of sheep, goats, or calves, each one selected for its quality and treated with meticulous care. The raw skins were first soaked in a lime solution to loosen the hair, then scraped clean with a curved knife, stretched tightly on a wooden frame, and left to dry under tension. As the skin dried, it was scraped again and again to achieve the smooth, even surface needed for fine writing. This work required strength as well as patience, for the goal was to produce a sheet that was thin yet durable, capable of holding ink without blotting and of lasting for centuries. Once dried and cut to size, the parchment was stacked in quires, groups of folded sheets that would later be sewn together to form the body of the book. To guide the writing, each sheet was carefully ruled with faint lines made by a stylus or lead point, ensuring that the text would be straight and evenly spaced. Alongside the parchment, ink was another crucial element, and its making was an art in itself. The deep black ink favored by many monasteries was created from a mixture of oak galls, which are small growths formed on oak trees, crushed and combined with iron salts and a binding agent such as gum arabic. This ink, once dry, bonded with the parchment so firmly that it resisted fading for centuries. For illumination and decoration, a different set of materials was needed. Pigments were prepared from minerals, plants, and other natural sources. The rich blue of lapis lazuli, imported from distant lands, the bright red of cinnabar or vermilion, the green of ground malachite, the yellow of saffron or orpiment. These pigments were ground into fine powders, mixed with binders such as egg white or glaire, and applied with small brushes made from animal hair. Gold leaf, used to create luminous initials and borders, was beaten into sheets so thin that a breath could move them, then carefully laid onto a prepared adhesive base and burnished to a mirror-like shine. Illumination was often the work of specialized monks whose skill with color and design matched the scribe's mastery of letters. The images and decorations served not only to beautify the page, but also to aid the reader, marking important passages or illustrating key scenes. In religious texts, these images might depict Christ, the Virgin Mary, saints, or symbolic creatures, all rendered in a style that combined spiritual meaning with artistic tradition. The interplay between text and decoration required careful planning. Spaces for initials and illustrations were left blank as the scribe worked, to be filled later by the illuminator. This meant that the creation of a single manuscript was a collaborative effort, sometimes involving multiple monks over many months or even years. Every stage of preparation, from stretching the parchment to applying the final stroke of gold, was done with a sense of purpose, for the monks knew that the books they created would endure far beyond their own lifetimes, carrying words and images into a future they could only imagine. The physical beauty of these manuscripts was not mere ornamentation. It was a reflection of the reverence with which the monks approached their task, a belief that the preservation of knowledge and the glory of God were worthy of the finest work their hands could offer. Even in the most disciplined of monastic scriptoria, mistakes were inevitable, for the work of copying a manuscript demanded perfect attention over long hours, and the human mind could drift for a moment. When an error was spotted, whether it was a misplaced letter, a missing word, or an entire skipped line, the scribe would pause, take up a small, sharp knife, and carefully scrape the ink away from the parchment, working slowly so as not to damage the surface. Once the mistake was removed, the area was smoothed with pumice, and the correct text was written in its place. If the error was too large to be fixed neatly, the scribe might add the missing passage in the margin, marking its place with a small symbol so that the reader would know where it belonged. These marginal additions could be purely practical, but they also revealed the personality of the monk behind the quill. In some manuscripts, there are tiny notes of fatigue, a line complaining of the cold in winter, of the dim light in the room, or of the cramp in a hand that had been writing since dawn. At other times, the notes might include a prayer for strength, a blessing for the reader, or a brief comment on the text itself. Some monks allowed small touches of humor to slip into their margins, perhaps drawing a tiny animal, a playful caricature, or a bit of decorative flourish that served no purpose other than to break the monotony of the page. These moments of humanity remind us that behind each manuscript was a living person, working patiently through the day, shaped by the same needs and thoughts that all people share. Corrections were also made by other monks who reviewed the work, for quality control was an important part of manuscript production. A corrector would sit with the finished copy and the original text side by side, reading line by line to ensure accuracy. If a word was misspelled or if a passage was copied incorrectly, he would make a small mark or insert a correction in the margin. Sometimes these corrections were done in a different ink, making them stand out even centuries later. Over time, as a manuscript passed from one monastery to another, new notes could be added, creating layers of commentary that spanned generations. This made some books not only vessels of their original text, but also living records of how that text had been read, interpreted, and preserved across the centuries. For the monks, these corrections and notes were not flaws, but signs of the care taken to ensure that what was passed forward was as faithful as possible to the source. Every line mattered, for a book could be the only copy of its kind within hundreds of miles. A single slip could change a meaning, alter a prayer, or distort a historical account. And so, with patience and humility, the scribes worked to bring each manuscript to a standard worthy of its purpose, knowing that in this labor there was both devotion and service, to God, to learning, and to the generations who would one day hold the very pages they had so carefully made. When a manuscript was finally complete, after months or even years of patient work, it entered the next stage of its life, the process of binding, storing, and safeguarding it for future generations. In most monasteries, binding was done by skilled brothers who specialized in the craft, for the preservation of a text depended as much on its physical protection as on the accuracy of the writing. The finished sheets, arranged in quires, were carefully checked to ensure they were in the correct order, then sewn together with linen or hemp threads using a strong but flexible stitch that would hold the gathering securely without stressing the parchment. These sewn blocks were then attached to wooden boards, often made from oak or beech, which served as the covers. The boards might be covered in leather, sometimes plain and functional, other times decorated with blind stamped patterns or fitted with metal clasps to keep the book closed tightly and protect it from warping and damp air. In more elaborate bindings, especially for important religious texts like Bibles or liturgical books, the covers could be adorned with gold leaf, precious stones, or panels of carved ivory, turning the book itself into a work of art. Once bound, the manuscript was not simply placed on a shelf at random. In well-organized monastic libraries, books were stored according to subject or use, often in cupboards or chests, to shield them from dust and light. Some monasteries kept their most precious works in special armoria, recessed cupboards built into the walls of the cloister, where they were locked for safekeeping. The climate and environment played an important role in preservation. In damp regions, care was taken to keep books away from moisture, while in drier climates, precautions were made to prevent the parchment from becoming brittle. Monks would occasionally open stored books to air them, checking for signs of mold or insect damage. Because each book was so valuable, lending was rare and done only with strict rules. Often a borrower had to leave another manuscript of equal value as a pledge until the loaned volume was returned. Yet manuscripts did travel, carried by monks journeying to other monasteries, by scholars invited to teach, or by emissaries delivering copies of important texts to distant patrons. Some made their way hundreds of miles from the place of their creation, crossing mountains and seas, passing through many hands over the decades. Along the way, they gathered traces of their journeys, marginal notes in new handwriting, repairs done in a different style, or the seal of a monastery far from the original scriptorium. Within the monastery walls, completed books played an essential role in the daily life of the community. They were read aloud in the refectory during meals, studied in the cloister during moments of reflection, and used in the chapel for the chanting of the divine office. For the monks, a finished manuscript was more than a physical object. It was the embodiment of months of discipline, prayer, and shared purpose, a lasting testament to the idea that the written word was a treasure worth protecting at all costs. And so each bound volume became part of a chain of preservation stretching backward to the ancient past and forward into an unseen future, carrying with it not only the text it contained, but the devotion of those who had given their lives to ensure it would endure. The libraries of medieval monasteries were more than quiet rooms filled with books. They were living repositories of knowledge, carefully organized and tended by monks who understood that the survival of a manuscript depended as much on its management as on the care with which it was made. In most monasteries, the librarian, often called the armarius, was responsible for overseeing the collection, ensuring that books were properly stored, recorded, and made available to those who needed them. Each volume was catalogued in a register, sometimes with a brief description of its contents, its origin, and even the name of the scribe who had copied it. Because books were so valuable, many monasteries had systems to track their movement. If a book was lent to another house or to a trusted scholar, the transaction was recorded, and often a deposit of equal worth was required to guarantee its return. Inside the library, the books were stored in cupboards, chests, or on wooden shelves, with some secured by chains to prevent their removal without permission. In larger and wealthier monasteries, the library might occupy a special room with tall, narrow windows that admitted light while protecting the parchment from direct sun. Smaller houses might keep their entire collection in a single locked cabinet in the cloister. The organization of books varied, but many collections were arranged by subject, scripture and theology at the center, surrounded by works on philosophy, law, medicine, history, and the liberal arts. Some libraries also contained secular literature, including the writings of ancient poets and philosophers, preserved because the monks believed that even non-religious works could offer moral instruction or useful knowledge. The sharing of manuscripts between monasteries formed an important network of intellectual exchange. A visiting monk might bring with him a text unknown in the host library, which could be copied in the scriptorium before he departed. Over decades and centuries, this exchange meant that ideas traveled slowly but steadily across Europe, with the words of ancient authors and medieval scholars passing from one quiet room to another, from Ireland to Italy, from the mountains of Switzerland to the plains of France. The library was also a place of study and contemplation. Monks would sit in the cloister, the covered walkway around the central garden, reading from books taken out under the armarius's supervision. Because books were scarce, reading was often done aloud, even when alone, so that the rhythm of the words could be absorbed more fully. Silence was respected, yet the soft murmur of a voice reading scripture or philosophy might drift through the cloister, blending with the sound of footsteps and the distant tolling of the bell. For the monks, the library was not merely a collection of objects, but a living treasury of the mind, each book a bridge to the past and a gift to the future. In tending to these volumes, the armarius and his fellow brothers were not just keeping order, they were preserving a legacy that had already survived wars, fires, and the slow decay of time, ensuring that the wisdom contained within would continue to guide, instruct, and inspire for generations yet to come. Throughout the centuries, monastic libraries faced numerous threats that tested the monks' determination to preserve their treasured manuscripts. The quiet sanctuaries of these libraries were not always safe from the upheavals of the outside world. Viking raids along the coasts of Europe, beginning in the late 8th century, brought violence and destruction to many monasteries, as these wealthy religious centers were often targeted for their riches, including their precious collections of books. Some monasteries were plundered and burned, manuscripts torn, lost, or destroyed, leaving gaps in the chain of knowledge that the monks had so carefully maintained. Yet, even in the face of such devastation, the monastic communities showed remarkable resilience. Monks would often risk their lives to save what they could, carrying precious volumes to hidden locations, or burying them in secure places to protect them from fire and pillage. These acts of preservation were not only practical, but deeply spiritual, reflecting a belief that the written word was a sacred trust, a gift from the past to be safeguarded for the future. Beyond the threat of raids, political turmoil and war often disrupted monastic life. Shifts in power, invasions, and civil unrest could lead to the abandonment of monasteries or their conversion for other uses. When secular rulers took control, libraries sometimes fell into neglect, their collections left vulnerable to decay or theft. In some regions, religious reforms or changes in patronage affected the resources available to monasteries, limiting their ability to acquire new manuscripts or maintain their buildings. Despite these challenges, the monks persisted. They adapted by copying manuscripts more quickly when danger loomed, sharing texts with other communities, and sometimes relocating entire collections to safer monasteries. In places less affected by conflict, monastic centers became hubs of learning, attracting scholars who sought to study and copy texts in safety. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century eventually changed the nature of book production. But for centuries before that, the monks' labor remained the lifeline of written knowledge in Europe. Their efforts ensured that classical works of philosophy, science, and literature survived the tumultuous medieval period, bridging the gap between antiquity and the Renaissance. The physical manuscripts that remain today, many preserved in libraries and museums around the world, bear witness to this long history of care, loss, and recovery. In their margins, one can sometimes find traces of hurried annotations made during times of crisis, prayers for protection, or simple notes marking the survival of a text against the odds. These manuscripts tell not only the stories contained within their pages, but also the story of the monks who devoted themselves to their preservation, a story of quiet heroism, patient devotion, and the unwavering belief in the power of the written word to transcend time and turmoil. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century marked a profound turning point in the history of book production and knowledge dissemination, but its arrival did not immediately render the painstaking work of the monastic scribes obsolete. For centuries, the monks who had devoted their lives to copying manuscripts had been the guardians of knowledge, the steady hands preserving the past through times of turmoil and change. The printing press introduced a new technology, movable type, that allowed books to be produced more quickly and in greater numbers than ever before. Suddenly, knowledge was no longer confined to the dimly lit scriptoria of monasteries, but could spread rapidly across cities, countries, and eventually continents. Yet the transition was gradual. Early printed books, known as incunabula, often imitated the style of manuscripts, complete with decorative initials and page layouts reminiscent of hand-copied volumes. This blend of old and new reflected a respect for the tradition that had preceded it, as well as a recognition of the aesthetic and spiritual qualities that manuscripts embodied. Many monasteries continued to copy texts by hand for some time, particularly those works that were rare or held special religious significance. Moreover, the art of illumination, the exquisite decoration of manuscripts with gold leaf and vivid pigments, remained beyond the reach of the printing press, which could not replicate such craftsmanship. The manuscripts themselves became treasured objects, valued not only for their content, but for their artistry and the human effort they represented. As printing presses multiplied, access to books expanded beyond the clergy and nobility to reach merchants, scholars, and eventually the broader public. This democratization of knowledge fueled the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution, all of which transformed European society in profound ways. Yet the legacy of the monks' labor was foundational. The texts that survived the dark centuries, carefully copied and preserved in monastic libraries, became the source material for printers and scholars. Without the dedication of these scribes, much of classical and early Christian literature might have been lost. The printing press also brought challenges: questions of censorship, the standardization of texts, and debates over the value of manuscript versus printed editions. But it also opened new possibilities for scholarship and education, allowing ideas to travel faster and more widely than ever before. In many ways, the invention of printing was a continuation rather than a replacement of the monks' work, a new chapter in the ongoing story of how humanity preserves and shares its knowledge. Even today, the beauty and care evident in medieval manuscripts remind us of a time when preserving a single book could take years of devotion, and when the written word was as much a sacred trust as it was a source of learning. Even after the widespread adoption of the printing press, the traditions of monastic manuscript copying did not disappear overnight. Instead, they evolved and persisted in various forms, maintaining a bridge between the ancient art of handcrafting books and the new age of mechanical reproduction. Some monasteries, especially those in remote or less industrialized regions, continued to copy texts by hand for many decades, not only as a means of preserving important religious and philosophical works, but also as an expression of devotion and craftsmanship. These scribes approached their work with the same reverence as their medieval predecessors, understanding that each manuscript was not merely a container of words, but a sacred object imbued with spiritual significance. In these communities, the act of copying remained a meditative practice, a form of prayer expressed through the slow, deliberate formation of letters and the application of intricate illuminations. Beyond the monasteries, collectors and scholars developed a renewed appreciation for manuscripts as unique artifacts of history and art. The libraries of universities and nobility began to preserve medieval manuscripts alongside printed books, recognizing the value of their craftsmanship, their marginalia, and their historical context. Manuscripts became prized not just for their content, but for the glimpse they offered into the lives and thoughts of the monks who made them. The tiny notes in margins, the variations in script, the subtle clues about the culture and beliefs of a bygone era. The study of these manuscripts gave rise to new academic disciplines, including paleography, codicology, and art history, fields dedicated to understanding the origins, construction, and decoration of historical books. This scholarly attention helped to secure the manuscripts' place in the cultural heritage of Europe and beyond, ensuring that their legacy would endure. In modern times, the digital age has brought a new dimension to the preservation and sharing of manuscripts. High-resolution photography and digital archives allow people around the world to access and study these ancient texts without risking damage to the fragile originals. Projects to digitize entire collections have opened up new possibilities for research, enabling scholars to compare texts, trace scribal hands, and analyze illuminations with unprecedented detail. At the same time, contemporary artists and calligraphers draw inspiration from the styles and techniques of monastic manuscripts, reviving the beauty and discipline of this ancient craft in new forms. The story of the monks who copied books for centuries is thus not only a tale of preservation, but also one of transformation and inspiration. Their meticulous work laid the foundation for the explosion of knowledge that followed the printing revolution and continues to influence how we value and interact with text today. Their legacy reminds us that the transmission of knowledge is both a technical challenge and a human endeavor, one that requires patience, care, and a deep respect for the power of the written word to connect generations across time and space. As we bring the story of the monks who copied books for centuries to a close, it is worth reflecting on the profound impact their quiet labor has had on the preservation and transmission of knowledge throughout history. For centuries, in dimly lit rooms scattered across the monasteries of Europe, these men devoted their lives to the painstaking work of copying texts by hand, often under challenging conditions of cold, limited light, and physical strain. Their efforts were more than mere transcription. They were acts of devotion, care, and hope. Hope that the wisdom of the past would survive the storms of time, war, and cultural change. The manuscripts they produced became treasures, sacred vessels that carried the voices of ancient philosophers, theologians, scientists, poets, and historians into a world that might otherwise have forgotten them. Without the dedication of these scribes, many of the texts we now take for granted might have been lost to the ravages of decay and destruction. Even as the printing press revolutionized the spread of ideas, the legacy of the monks endured. The aesthetic beauty of illuminated manuscripts continues to inspire artists and scholars, while the survival of classical and medieval works rests heavily on the foundation built by these patient hands. Their work reminds us that knowledge is fragile, that it must be nurtured and protected, and that the transmission of culture is a collective responsibility spanning generations. In a world now dominated by digital communication and instant access to information, it is humbling to remember a time when each book was a rare and precious object, the result of months or years of careful labor. The monks' manuscripts embody the values of patience, perseverance, and respect for learning. Values that remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. Their story invites us to slow down, to appreciate the human effort behind the texts we read, and to honor the long chain of hands and minds that have shaped our shared heritage. As you drift into sleep, let the memory of these quiet scribes remind you that even the smallest acts of care can have a lasting impact, that knowledge passed gently from one to another is a treasure beyond measure, and that the stories of the past continue to live in the pages we hold today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you again tomorrow evening, wishing you a morning full of luck and boundless energy when you wake up. Goodbye for now, and I look forward to seeing you again on the Sleep Whisper channel.